Hello everyone and welcome back to another video, where today I want to talk to you about how I made a game for the GMTK 2025 Game Jam. The theme this year was looping, and upon hearing that, my mind immediately knew exactly what I wanted to do. That being, I wanted to make a three-dimensional non-Euclidean platformer on a surface wrapped around a tesseract. Now, that might seem like a very weird thing for someone's mind to immediately jump to, but there were a couple of reasons why my mind in particular jumped to this. The first is quite simply because I already have a fascination in higher dimensional spaces and non-Euclidean geometry. In fact, for years I've had plans on making four-dimensional chess, which also takes place on a non-Euclidean 3D surface wrapped around a tesseract, or what I call the Chesseract. While at this point I've only made a test model for the board for the game so far, I do have plans to actually make it a real game in a few decades or so. But while four-dimensional chess is a game that uses non-Euclidean 3D geometry, it is definitely not a platformer like Around the Tesseract is. My idea for making the game a platformer came from just a personal preference of mine. I like platformers, what can I say? Also, I felt like the game being a platformer could show off some of the looping aspects of non-Euclidean geometry well, with infinitely long hallways and infinite falls. I think I was trying to scratch the itch of the infinite falls you could get in Portal 2 by putting a portal above and below you. I think I was also inspired by Holonomy, a game by FuzzyZilla, which is an excellent depiction of my idea with a non-Euclidean two-dimensional surface wrapped around a cube. With that being said, actually making non-Euclidean 3D geometry is easier said than done, and is where I spent most of my time in this 4-day game jam. To give an explanation of how I envision this geometry, I'll take a step back and talk about how a two-dimensional being could rationalize a non-Euclidean two-dimensional surface, for example, a two-dimensional surface wrapped around a cube. If a 2D being is on one side of a cube, let's call it the starting side, he can see a side in each of his orthogonal directions. Let's call them the x, -x, y, and -y sides. Then there's also a side that is on the other side of the cube that's also attached to the adjacent sides, which we can call the opposite side. We can represent this in 2D somewhat easily as an unfolded net, but that leaves gaps between some of the sides, such as the x and y sides, which while connected on a cube are disconnected in the net. We can fix this issue by stretching the adjacent sides into trapezoids that form connections between each adjacent side and the sides they're next to. This just leaves the opposite side, which is only connecting to one adjacent side right now, but it needs to connect to each other adjacent side as well. Thankfully, we know from a real cube where the two exposed vertices should go, and we can set them into the right position by on the net pulling them through the square. Just like that, we have what the surface wrapped around a cube would look like mapped out to a 2D creature. Granted, an actual 2D creature would probably physically see the world like this, since the surface is essentially spherical geometry with some hard edges. But if the creature were to try to map out the surface, it would probably do so like this, or as an unfolded net. That being said, one thing I want to show you before moving on to the non-Euclidean 3D surface is the non-Euclidean 2D surface rotating, since it looks like this. You can see how the starting square, or inner square, warps to become the -x adjacent square, the x adjacent square unwarps to become the new inner square, the outer square gets inverted and warps to become the new x adjacent square, and how the -x square inverts and unwarps to become the new outer square. You can also see the y and -y squares rotating to keep their edges synced up with the adjacent faces. With the concept explained, let's move on to how I actually made the surface in 3D for the game jam. Before I made the central gimmick though, the first thing I did was make a simple character controller. This step wasn't necessarily complicated, but making a character that actually feels responsive yet alive takes some work. This includes everything from tweaking speed and force values, to setting directional values depending on the camera's rotation, and tweening some shape keys together for basic animations. As for why the character is a cube, I realized that I would need to explain the concept of non-Euclidean space in a lower dimension, and having the player be a cube allowed me to make the tutorial around the player's body, but we'll talk about the tutorial a little later. With the player done, the next thing I started working on was the Tesseract. The way I handled this was by having a game manager store a bunch of side nodes. Each side node had a list of any geometry or objects in the side. Additionally, I had the side keep track of its current direction and the direction that the player was rotating the Tesseract. Whenever the player goes out of bounds, the game manager pauses the game and moves the player to a new position using Godot's tweening tools. Then, while the game is paused, it is constantly incrementing a timer, which can be used for the factor of how far each side should move each mesh inside of it. Unfortunately, actually deforming the meshes between positions is significantly easier said than done. This is because 1. Actually computing the new position for each vertex in each model requires a lot of math, and 2. Godot does not like deforming meshes. Let's start with the second problem first, the ability to deform meshes. Godot does have some materials on creating meshes. Specifically, you can pass a mesh into a surface tool to turn one of its surfaces into an array mesh. You can then pass the array mesh into a mesh data tool to get and set mesh information before committing it back to an array mesh, which a mesh instance can have its mesh property be set to. In order to properly use these tools, first on startup I break each mesh into individual surfaces and make a unique mesh instance for each surface. Next, before I started any deformation, I would go ahead and record the starting positions of all vertices. Then, while the rotation was in progress, I was able to determine where each vertex should be placed after the rotation was completed, and then I was able to set the current vertex position to a lerped value between the starting and ending position depending on the tween time factor. Then, each mesh instance would have its mesh property set to the new mesh made up of the current vertices. After the rotation was complete, each side would have all of its current and target directions updated, and then, if the side was the inner cube, I could generate collisions from the meshes so the terrain would physically exist. As for the first problem of how to determine where each vertex's target position should be, it mostly came in 3 parts. The first was building a warping and unwarping tool, essentially one that could turn the inner cube into any adjacent cube and vice versa. This just involves some fun algebra. Nothing too scary, although I did originally do the unwarping factor wrong because I inverted my math incorrectly. Essentially, the 90% of 110% is not 100% problem, just scaled up. The next part was rotating vertices, which didn't need a specialized method since one already exists for 3D vectors. The last part was stitching together a switch statement of all possible scenarios. What I could, and if this were an actual commercial game, would do is a procedural decision for each point. With the time crunch of the game jam, I thought a switch statement tree for the 42 possible cases would be easier, especially since each case was just a set of unwarping, rotating, and rewarping functions. For instance, whenever you enter a cube, it's just a matter of unwarping it. Whenever you leave the inner cube, it gets warped to the adjacent cube behind you. The cube behind you gets unwarped, inverted, and scaled up to become the outer cube. The outer cube is scaled down, inverted, and warped to become the cube in front of you, and any other adjacent cube is unwarped, rotated, and rewarped to appear like it's rotating in place. And that sums up the main gimmick of the game. The majority of my remaining time went to making the tutorial where the Great Cube Elder teaches you how Non Euclidean 2D geometry works, which needed its own dialogue system, player controller, and level, which by the way is entirely 3D. In fact, all of the collision is also 3D. Just thought that was funny enough to point out. Recreating all of these systems took a lot of time, and came with a lot of bugs and problems, especially when it came to pausing the game and rotating the cube. I would honestly say this tutorial took about a third of the game jam. And just like that, the game jam was over, and voting proceeded. I ended up placing in the top quarter for narrative, with low scores for everything else, which, to be honest, I was expecting. Non-Euclidean geometry is not something people can just immediately wrap their head around and get it, and since my game lacked a lot of substance with only 3 real levels, no music, sound effects, polish, or artwork, I can definitely understand it not doing well in the scoring department. Even still, I am proud of being able to make this non-Euclidean game for the express reason that I was able to make a rotating Tesseract, which I think is really cool. However, there is one thing that I hated. This. Did you spot it? When I moved in the z direction, the negative x cube rotated the wrong way. In fact, that property is necessary for beating level 3, since I thought that the Tesseract spaces separating was a product of the outer cube inverting, and was normal. After thinking about the level after the game jam had ended, I realized I had to be wrong, and that's when I found a bug. To make up for the bug, and for level 3 needing to be removed since it used the bug to open up the exit, after voting ended, I patched the bug and created a new level 3. I will say that I think the new level 3 is the only true puzzle in the game, and if you watch this video to the end, I think you might like it, so go ahead and check out the updated game on my itch.io page. A link to that is in the description. With that, thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Goodbye.